Italy gave the world beauty, but beauty can hide decline. Behind the museums, cathedrals, and postcard skylines, one of Europe's largest economies has been drifting toward a slow-moving crisis, not a sudden collapse. Something more dangerous, years of weak growth, a mountain of debt, fragile politics, a shrinking population, and a system that keeps absorbing pressure without truly solving it. That is how the most dangerous crises begin, quietly. Slowly, then all at once. And if that moment comes for Italy, Europe may discover that the real threat was never the crisis everyone feared, but the one that took too long to look like a crisis at all. For generations, Italy stood as a symbol of refinement, culture, and human achievement. Rome, Florence, Venice, Milan, names that carry centuries of influence. But behind that beauty, another reality has been taking shape. Italy is not collapsing in the dramatic way people imagine. There are no burning banks on every street, no sudden default, no day when the whole world realizes the danger has arrived. Instead, Italy is weakening slowly. Because slow crises are easy to ignore, people adapt, politicians postpone, markets tolerate, pressure builds until what once looked manageable starts to look irreversible. That is why Italy matters far beyond Italy. This is not just the story of one country in trouble. It is a story about what happens when structural problems are delayed for too long inside one of Europe's most important economies. When a small economy fails, the damage can sometimes be contained. But when a country as large and connected as Italy begins to crack, the entire European system feels it. Countries like Greece, Portugal, and Ireland suffered brutal crises, but those economies were small enough for European institutions to support and contain. Italy is one of the largest economies in the Euro area. A founding part of the European project, too central to ignore and too large to rescue easily if pressure ever becomes severe enough. And the real danger is not one isolated problem, it is the convergence of several pressures. The first is debt. Italy has carried a massive public debt burden for years, and that burden limits almost every future decision. When a country owes that much, growth becomes essential. A growing economy can make old debt easier to manage. A stagnant one cannot. For much of the last 2 decades, growth has been weak, productivity has disappointed, younger workers have struggled to find strong opportunities. In many parts of the country, the feeling is not momentum, but drift. Government obligations do not pause when growth is weak. Pensions still need funding, public services still need financing, interest still has to be paid. And when borrowing costs rise, the pressure grows heavier. Money that could go toward investment instead goes toward servicing old obligations. That creates a trap. Italy needs stronger growth to ease the burden of debt. But the weight of debt makes it harder to invest in the future that could produce growth. The second pressure is the banking system. Banks connect savings, credit, business activity, and confidence. When they are weak, the weakness spreads quietly through everything else. Italy has faced banking stress before. Troubled loans, fragile balance sheets, and repeated interventions have left observers wondering how resilient parts of the system would be in a serious downturn. But the deeper danger is the connection between banks and the state. When banks hold large amounts of their own government's debt, and that government is already under pressure, the two become tightly linked. If confidence falls in the state's finances, banks feel it. If banks need support, the state feels it. That creates a dangerous loop. Weak public finances can weaken banks. Weak banks can intensify pressure on the state. The third pressure is demographic decline. Italy has one of the lowest birth rates in the developed world. Fewer children are being born, the population is aging, and many younger people leave in search of stronger opportunities elsewhere. An older population means higher pension and healthcare costs. A smaller working-age population means fewer taxpayers supporting those systems. Over time, that balance becomes harder to sustain, but the deeper damage is psychological. When young people stop believing they can build a secure future at home, the consequences go beyond labor markets. A country begins to lose confidence in itself. Ambition fades, communities grow older, towns empty out. What should feel like renewal begins to feel like retreat. The fourth pressure is politics. Italy is famous for political turnover, coalition governments, and instability. That matters because structural problems usually require long-term reforms, and long-term reforms require continuity. Real reform always carries a price. Pension reform angers voters. Labor reform angers voters. Spending cuts anger voters. Tax increases anger voters too. Almost every serious solution comes with immediate pain. and that makes delay politically tempting, because the cost of acting is obvious now, while the cost of delay feels distant until suddenly it no longer is. And this is where the story becomes larger than Italy, because Italy is dealing with all of these pressures inside the euro area. That brings benefits, but it also removes certain tools countries once used in times of stress. A country with its own currency can sometimes devalue to regain competitiveness. Inside a shared currency system, that path is much narrower. So if productivity lags, growth weakens, and competitiveness drifts, the burden of adjustment falls more heavily on workers, public finances, and political stability. That is why Italy's problem is not simply one bad government or one bad policy. It is a mismatch between long-term economic realities and the constraints of a shared system, because slow crises are often the most dangerous ones. They build quietly beneath the surface until something changes. A recession, a surge in borrowing costs, a banking shock, a political rupture, a sudden loss of investor confidence. That is how long-running fragility becomes a real crisis. Not all at once, but then all of a sudden. And if that moment arrives in a country as large and systemically important as Italy, Europe will face questions it has spent years trying not to answer. How much support can the system really provide? How much sacrifice will voters accept? How long can political unity survive under economic strain? And what happens if one of the central pillars of the European project no longer believes the arrangement is working? That is why Italy is not just an Italian story. It is a test of whether a grand economic design can endure when its members age differently, grow differently, borrow differently, and vote differently. Italy once helped define the cultural identity of Europe. Now it may help define Europe's economic future too, because the real danger is not a dramatic collapse tomorrow morning. The real danger is a prolonged weakening that keeps narrowing the options until every remaining choice becomes painful. And when that day comes, Europe will discover whether its union was built to endure pressure or merely to survive good times. Because Italy is not only revealing its own vulnerabilities, it may be revealing the fault lines of the entire European project. And if those fault lines finally begin to open, the next crisis will not look like the last one. It will be larger, it will be closer, and it will be far harder to contain.